Hello, my name is Sophie Holder, Executive Officer at De Montfort University, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you to another talk in our anti-racism series. Now, the anti-racism series is a set of lectures and presentations that focus on issues of race as they relate to different fields in academia and beyond, as well as ways to oppose and counter racial prejudice and systemic racism. Now, today our talk coincides with Black History Month, a time that we take to recognize the history, contribution, and achievements of African and Caribbean people of heritage. Today's talk will be talking about an issue that is very popular at the moment, but also I would say is under research, and that is Black mental health. We are joined by two speakers today who I'm very excited to be joining us and who will be leading out in our talk. Firstly is Dr. Jason Apaloo-Shonibare, who is a London-based child community and educational psychologist who has professional experience as a youth community and mental health practitioner. Now, Jason's career has included work across the NHS, educational provisions, and even a brief occupation within the London Met Police Services. Jason will be discussing his research, which explores the intersection of racism and ableism for students who identify as South Asian, African, and/or Caribbean heritage, as well as those who have a special educational need or disability. Our second speaker, who will lead directly on from Jason, is Dr. Yusef Bakkali, a native of South London and a Legacy in Action Research Fellow at the Stephen Norris Research Centre. Now, Yusef's areas of expertise are youth, social exclusion, race, crime, and decoloniality and masculinities. Today, he'll be talking about the MUN pain, which seeks to make clear the structural situatedness of individual suffering and malaise in Black men. Now, each speaker will follow on from each other, after which there will be a discussion with myself and the speakers. There will also be a portion where we'll have the questions and answers sections after the presentation. So be sure to write down any of your questions in the chat box and we'll get through as many as we can at the end. But without any further ado, please let us firstly welcome Dr. Jason Apaloo-Shonibare.
Hello, everyone. Hi. Really glad to be here and grateful to De Montfort University and my co-speaker for this opportunity. Thank you for having me. Before I get started and jump into my research, I really wanted to just put a few things out there so we kind of start this space as we mean to go on. For me, it's really important that I recognize myself as a practitioner in the field. I'm an educational psychologist, yes. But I'm also still learning. I don't want to position myself as any sort of expert per se on this particular issue, but rather speak to it in a place of we're all learning and kind of uncovering some new knowledge and insight. And hopefully we can do some of that today together and share. But also thinking about this idea that this is a passion project for me. You know, I'm very connected to the material, and I feel like if we can bring our authentic selves to the space, it will make it even more meaningful and powerful. So hopefully you will join me in that. And with that being said, I want to just talk about exactly what Sophie just kindly introduced, which is my research. So I wanted to start by labeling what it was I was trying to do. So this was part of my doctoral thesis, and I spent 3 years really thinking about what would be a good and useful area for me to bring to the fore, and one that I deemed to be under-researched and I could add value. So that's where I landed. I came across a lady called Kimberly Crenshaw who spoke about a concept which really spoke to me, and I had to incorporate it into my research. But I think it's worth pointing out that some of the ways in which we can position ourselves within our own research can and do influence the ways in which that research plays out. So as you see me, and as I identify, I'm a Black man. I'm a father. I am someone who grew up in inner London, and I spent a lot of time working with schools and communities around schools to think about what is a helpful curriculum for the young people who are there, how we can support the community around schools, the parents who engage with schools, teachers and staff in general, so as to make sure that education feels like it is a much more equitable platform. And it does its job of teaching us not just a curriculum which has been predefined, but also supports us to think about the ways in which we offer a perspective and a narrative to the world, how we choose to engage with the world that we're in following our time in education. So for those reasons, I think it's important to highlight that my research was and is focused on further education and some of the autonomy that comes from being in that stage of adolescence where perhaps you feel like you've got a bit more choice over what you choose to study and how you're going to go about that, be it vocational courses or much more traditional means. So my research title was exploring how intersectionality theory can influence and impact on the experiences of students who have got further education, who are in further education, sorry, who have got special educational needs, but also, and that key overlap is they also identify as from an African, Caribbean, or South Asian heritage or background. And the context of the research was that this happened during COVID, and there was a whole bunch of emphasis on what it means to be a student in an institution where perhaps systemic factors may feel like you recognize, or there is statistics and data around which highlights the impact of exclusion rates and who those more disproportionately affect, but also challenging behavior and how that's managed, what types of individuals are hired in schools to manage challenging behavior. And some of those intersections of identity were becoming more prominent and more something I was aware of in my practice as a psychologist. So I thought that I would pick a subject area that for me was powerful, it was informative, and it helped me to think about some of the systemic and overlying factors that have accounted for and continue to contribute to some of this inequity and social injustice that we are talking about and often experience if you're from particular groups. But I figured to myself that it was a bit more complicated than that. And it wasn't just, as the figures speak about, the Black community that was only affected by inadequacies and injustices within the education system. But there was also speak about, for instance, those highest proportions of exclusion rates being young Black Caribbean boys. And so I wondered what it was about those 2 or 3 or 4 different protective factors, the different ways in which we can identify, that was playing out for those young people that would have an impact on why they were more at risk of exclusion. And that was a feature, was a massive instigator of why I started to pursue this particular line of inquiry and research question. So I wanted to talk about the context a little bit, but I also wanted to talk about language and terminology. Whilst I was putting all of these ideas together and trying to imagine a way in which I could research this in a more equitable and accessible way, some of the questions that I had was, you know, a lot of the literature talks about BAME. And I know that this is a terminology that people are struggling with still, and it does not feel quite as progressive as perhaps we would like. So what is that saying? What's going on there? Who's using this terminology, and how is it being used to define a community of communities or a group of people within groups of people that have very rich and diverse ways of identifying themselves? And it was through a lot of research and investigation that I started to think about different ways in which identity is constructed. And not just identity, but I guess identities. And in my research, I speak about this idea of a pluralism approach, this idea that identity is both socially constructed, complex, and multifaceted. And there are ways in which we can, for example, by using the protective factors, so gender, race, religion, identify ourselves or use those particular identity markers. But there are also other ways. So there's theory around social graces. So we think about the GRACES and how they all stand as acronyms for various aspects of identity. So we have gender, race, age, culture, ethnicity, social status, education's in there, and all of these things. So what does it mean for us to think about ourselves within these defined categorical ways, and how, if at all, do they overlap for individuals? Well, I explained when I first introduced myself that I'm a Black man, but I'm way more than that. I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm a husband, I'm all of these things to different people, but they may be identities that I connect with, but I may have other ways of identifying myself as well, based on my hobbies on the weekend, based on the ways in which I align my worldview or my values. I can find different groupings and different delineations based on however I choose to, but some of those things are more forced upon me, I may feel. And that's an important factor in how I was trying to understand and work with my research participant group, because for those who are in education, there is a context around the system in which they have been placed or choose to be in, the college, the university, and what that then means for them in the context of their identities that they have been defined as or choose to define themselves as, but also have been the identities they've been choose to define as, but also how those identities are linked to discriminative practices. And that's why I chose to focus on racism and ableism, because in my mind, there was an overlap that was tangible and meaningful and has already been researched through disability critical race theory and studies. And there is a body of research which focuses on, as well as how intersectionality approaches it, focuses on the ideas that there is an overlap in some of our identities that has a relationship to the power within the systems that we find ourselves in that cannot be ignored. Kimberly Crenshaw, I have to mention her, she coined the term intersectionality, and she speaks to this idea of what does it mean for an individual who has a complex or compound understanding of their identity to navigate themselves through the world and experience what could be called a double discrimination or a double oppression. That effect can be multiple, so it can be attached to multiple identities, and it can have a knock-on impact on many outcomes. We're speaking about men's mental health here. So if we think about men broadly, all the dissections of society in which men can occupy. So we think about the LGBTQIA plus community. We think about men from racially minoritized backgrounds. We think about men who were, there's various ways in which we could split that group down. And in those intersections, we understand and begin to learn a bit more, a nuanced understanding of what it means to have an intersectional experience. And as a result, the privileges and the discriminations or the dominance and the oppression plays out for individuals based on their internal and external ways of identifying and being identified socially. So I've said a lot there, and I recognize that for me, this was a massive thing to get my head around, this conceptual framework of identity being multiple and that discrimination can occur across those overlaps and those layers. But I also recognize that in my context, it was very true. It was very real. My mom doesn't mind me bringing her up, but I often use her as an example when thinking about what Kimberly Crenshaw was talking about, which is that from a legal framework in America, there was a whole bunch of emphasis on how women of color, as they were referenced in the literature, had but one opportunity to try and attempt to gain, what would you call, compensation or remuneration for what had been mistreatment in their employment. So Kimberly Crenshaw speaks about this idea that women of color in America, in the legal framework, were seen as either Black or women. And the fact that they overlapped and the discrimination that they could experience at both levels, that intersectional experience, was not accounted for within the legal literature or frameworks. So judgments, rulings around legal policy or the recognition of their discrimination at its multiple layers, the richness of that context wasn't accounted for. And I think my research was an effort to try and bring a different lens to, well, the same lens to a different grouping of individuals. So I looked at racism and ableism within a college context, and I began to explore what some of the participants' experiences were through, as best as I could, a narrative approach. So that really privileged the participants' voice and encouraged them to feel like they could speak to me about whether or not racism was real, whether or not they experienced it directly or indirectly, whether or not ableism was real, whether or not they experienced it directly or indirectly, and to what degree those things overlapped or not. Now, I was speaking to students who were post-16, and they had some really helpful insights that I've tried to capture in my research. But there were 6 themes that came out of that, and I just wanted to speak about those very quickly. One was that all of the students had an adverse early educational experience. They didn't like maths, they didn't like English, and they didn't feel like they were good at those things either. Now, they didn't necessarily attribute that to racism or ableism, but they did recognize that they had had a harder early education than their counterparts in school period, whether they be without special educational needs or disability, or from a different background that wasn't racially minoritized. The other theme was all about their connection to their racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds. And that was supported by the third theme, which was the parental influence. So what effect, or how, as we call them, a cultural conduit, a parent can operate in helping us to understand who we are, our racial and ethnic identity. And what's interesting about that particular theme was the mixed race experience. So we spoke about, and I had a participant who was from dual heritages, where one parent was Jamaican and another parent was white British. And he discussed at length the context in which he felt like he could identify with either both and or one of those particular backgrounds at different points in his experience. The fourth theme was around broad and a fluid sense of identity. So this is what I'm trying to speak to here, which is this idea that identity, yes, can be categorized by your gender, for instance, or your levels of ability, able-bodied or not, as some might choose to look at it or frame it rather. But also there's this idea that your identity can be, for instance, the example that was given in the research, I want to be a nice person. I want to be someone who people think is kind. And so that value system or that belief that you are doing good in the world or able to do good was, for one of my participants, a prevailing feeling. That's how I want to identify as a kind person. The other themes were around systems of power. So they spoke about the police, they spoke about institutions of education, they spoke about the government and COVID's impact on their feelings of disproportionality and safety in their community. And also, finally, the last theme was around the power of the self. So how can we self-advocate for ourselves, knowing that we may be a victim to not just one prejudice and racism, but also ableism and or others, plus the compound effect. Consciousness and awareness for the participants was a massive factor. And I did have a student participant who said, I haven't experienced racism, which surprised me. And I found that really interesting, and it informed my research quite a lot. But also there was the context of how people who don't have, who don't connect to or are not aligned with that identity marker may speak to you about that identity marker. So these may be people who are posing as allies or attempting to be allies, and their context of their questions might be around how I may choose to see myself or understand myself. So the example given was one of my participants spoke about being a he was a young man who had special educational needs but also had a disability, and he was Muslim. So he spoke about someone from his community who was also Muslim, trying to help him to reframe his disability as a gift from God. And he took great issue with that. He felt like it wasn't a shared lived experience that that person could connect with. So how could they police his tone or encourage him to reframe his view of what his disability was when they hadn't shared his lived experience? So that spoke a little bit to the allyship or attempt at allyship that that person made for that participant, and how ultimately that links to this idea that none of us really know what's going on for people who are living through these experiences. And I think that does connect back to my profession. So as I mentioned, I'm an educational psychologist, but I have never suffered or struggled with special educational needs in school. In fact, I've done quite well academically. But in terms of my positionality as a researcher, and I think myself and Yusef will speak on this, there is a context that I have to hold on to, which is that I may have some lived experience as a man who's been Black in Britain and grown up through an education where it wasn't always easy, but I've not struggled in the same ways where my academic attainment was measured by my ability, and there was a plan or a piece of paper which depicted my ability as lesser than. So I've said a lot, and I'm very mindful of how conceptual some of this can be sometimes. I too still trip up on it, but I think it's important to speak to some of that reflexivity of research and how myself and any participant or researcher, we're going to interact, and that may play out in different ways, but that lived experience of intersectionality can help us to reframe and structure our thinking around what it means to be experiencing discrimination. It could be unitary, it could be multifaceted, but yeah, I'm hoping to explore that in more detail. I'm very mindful of the time and I'm very grateful. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Yusef Bakkali now.
So I was on mute. Thanks, Jason. That was really interesting. And there were a few things actually about Jason's talk. I'll come back to them in a sec that I thought were really interesting and I want to come back around to. Just quickly, I'm not a psychologist. I'm a sociologist really by training. My work or the work that kind of some of the reflections I want to talk about today come from was I did a study about life on road, which if you're not familiar with it, there's lots of different kind of couchings and ways in which people might try to define it. I sort of vaguely or loosely define it as like a youth street culture milieu. There's quite a lot of popular representations that perhaps aren't quite truthful or accurate, but they're significant as well. Shows like Top Boy, quite a lot in popular music as well, like reputations of road and road life, and so kind of Get Up and Garb. I think I'm trying to think about it as a much more fluid and loose thing, that you don't have to be actively involved in crime to be involved or adjacent or some way connected to aspects of this kind of like common like road culture. And I want to kind of come at this from a perspective of a sociologist. So I'm a little bit critical, or critical is the word, of psychology as a discipline, because obviously as a sociologist, we would have a different focus. And also the criticisms I make of psychology aren't criticisms that sociology is invulnerable to. In fact, a lot of them could be applied across the board. But I think I'm going to start there and then go into my work as a way of trying to understand why I did what I did. And the two major criticisms, and they come from like a kind of perspective inside psychology. There's like, me and Jason were talking just before we came on air, there's like emancipatory psychology, critical psychology, which is kind of the big umbrella for a lot of those, like emancipatory, liberatory, different forms of psychology that sort of come under the kind of banner. But the kind of dominant forms, or the forms that kind of receive the most funding, often kind of will be the core part of your, if you're doing a psychology degree, for example, often are kind of more connected to the sciences, more connected to like positivists or like scientific methods, more connected to what I would describe as a dominant perspective in psychology. Doesn't mean that all psychologists are practicing the same. And one of the things I wanted to comment on about Jason's talk actually was that he was reluctant to describe, even though I know Jason as a practitioner, I've worked with him in the past, and he is an expert. He's good at what he does, but he's reluctant to describe himself as an expert because when you're a psychologist, it's more about getting along. In my perspective, or the kind of psychology I would advocate for, it's more important to get alongside people, understand communities, and work with communities than to administer to communities. And I think that's one of the first big criticisms I would make about psychology. And when we're thinking about Black communities, Asian communities, other forms of other minoritized communities, or in some ways disempowered communities, whether it's people that, in poverty, and I'm talking globally now, I think psychology generally, part of its success in the ways in which we understand ourselves and the world is that it's, in its most dominant forms, aligned itself with powerful perspectives. So if you think about psychology, the things that it makes possible are like individual interventions. So for example, they talk about crises of mental health amongst men, or crises of mental health in the Black community. You see higher sectioning rates in Black and minority ethnic communities often. But what it makes possible is making interventions at individual level. But it doesn't offer often very much explanation as to why, for example, we might be seeing those higher sectioning rates, or we might be seeing this widespread crisis in men's mental health, because it enables that, like from a policy perspective, those kind of interventions. And if you look at kind of the direction of travel of societies in the West, they're often traveling in this direction of individualism. So like they're becoming more about individuals, what individuals can earn, what individuals can do, and less about the collective, less social security, less support, less concern about social problems generally, particularly on from the perspective of the state. And I think psychology can or has been quite closely aligned with it. And that's been also a source of power within the discipline. You've seen sociology go into a massive decline as a discipline, and psychology is sort of still quite a big part of, you know, our medical and state services, but also culturally. So how many books on self-help are there? How many books are there that we read, or how we understand ourselves, that at some level you could trace their genealogy back to Freud or Jung or someone else? Do you know what I mean? So I would say that that's one criticism of psychology. Other criticism also that kind of connected is that it's sort of Eurocentric in its perspective. And when we're talking about race, so there's this imaginary of, like, you know, if you have a scientific method, you kind of have to have a universality or universalism with the people that you're, or, you know, in terms of conditions, in terms of treatment, in terms of recognizing. And so it's got that element of, when we're thinking about who this imagined person is, or this generalized or universalized person is, often you find it's the perspectives of, or dispositions of, white, European or North American, who are originally European, often people. And that makes it also a bit difficult. What Jason was talking about is understanding perspectives and empowering perspectives of people in our communities often isn't done on a big scale, on a grand scale. You have individual practitioners like Jason, who I know well and who I know is doing that kind of work. But I think when you're talking about at a policy level and at a kind of state or national level, it's not a priority and it's not happening, recognizing difference and recognizing the perspective of individual. And I think that would be another kind of connected issue, is that we're talking about top-down psychology, and not all psychology or psychologies are top-down psychologies, but the ones that when we want to access mental health services from the NHS, when we want to access those services or things like that from the state, they're being administered from the top down, and that that ability to recognize difference is often absent, and it can lead to serious repercussions for people in communities who are suffering from things that perhaps if you're a white middle class European person, it would be difficult for you to imagine. And that kind of brings me on to a paper I wrote a few years ago called The Mum Pain. Part of the concept is called The Mum Pain, not the title of the paper. And the Mum Pain I wrote, portmanteau of pain and mundane. And it was kind of something that the participants in my study were describing in everyday life. So they were describing kind of pains and anxieties. I described it as a malaise that they experience in everyday life. And from the kind of extracts and the kind of things that they were saying, you could kind of argue that it's possible that someone might diagnose these people with depression, maybe other common mental illnesses or issues that could be treated through kind of conventional psychology. But I kind of created the Mum Pain or developed it. I didn't actually say this explicitly because it's a big thing to come out and say that in a paper about psychology, but as a language to describe suffering that is anchored into the social environment that people live in. So I wasn't describing this suffering that they were experiencing as a defect or a deficit in these people individually. I was trying very hard to connect their suffering into the wider structural environment that they lived in. The two young men in that article particularly were formerly or semi-active, involved in sort of gangs in South London, and they'd been sort of exposed to violence. But actually, what was interesting is their exposure to physical violence in their narratives was kind of sidelined by actually different kinds of violence that they experienced in their life. And part of that violence was racism. Part of that violence was the social expectation of performing blackness or masculinity. Part of that violence was education in schools not being recognized and not being valued. Lots of things like this. And I tried to construct the article around that to understand how suffering is actually anchored into social problems often. And this individualist approach to trying to treat individual people who are suffering is always going to be a bit like chasing your tail, because the problem is a social problem. We have this problem that is racism. We have this problem that is, and we can make more direct interventions into these problems on a structural level. But my argument basically is that the will isn't there. The political will isn't there because that doesn't often suit the most powerful. It's expensive. It's asking questions about the status quo and the power structure of our society, who's in charge of it, etc., etc. So oftentimes that's not happening. And I'll read you a little extract, if you want, from one of the participants, just to give you a flavor of the kind of things they said. And in this extract, we were talking about the possibility of people on road who'd been exposed to violence, suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, because that's something that came out from the literature in the USA. And the participant Stephen said this, because I asked, and what was interesting about this, he didn't really talk about hyperviolence. He didn't really talk about stabbing. He didn't really talk about gangs. He didn't talk about any of these kind of things. He talked about everyday struggles and everyday suffering. So he said a lot of people do still. There's a lot of people on the road, like they might have that bravado, like, yeah, rare, the tough guy. But when the lights go out and it's just them and their thoughts, it can turn people crazy still. I've seen it turn people crazy, and they might feel depressed, but people don't know that. And people just be like, they be thinking, like I said, the whole roadman joke. When people be running jokes, I kind of get angry. So like, I don't know, these people are going through, you don't know what these people are going through. You lot just think it's a joke. And they'll shed light on stupid stuff, but there's a lot of people, I know a lot of people that go through that. And so I asked him, so do you think the roads can be emotionally draining? And he said, yeah, because they don't feel there's a lot of people that they can talk to. And they might tell their brethren, yo, man, listen, man, I'm going through something. And their brethren might be like, man, toughen up, stop crying. It's not that deep. You feel me? So you can't go to your friend and be like, brother, I'm going through something kind of mad. They'll just be like, listen, man, stop crying, toughen up, stop moving like a punk. Do you know what I mean? So just like, then you got to go home. And it's like, who you going to go to? That's why a lot of people I know a lot of men confided in women. And they were doing that. And I said, because they're hurting. He said, yeah, because they're hurting. And they think that a woman's going to help it heal. But it's not even that, man. It's just you understanding what's going on. It's just you understanding yourself. And I think that last line from Stephen is something to close on. Is that my basically big criticism, and I think something that connects into what Jason was saying, is that the services and psychology and the ways in which it's aligned to individualism, but from a very Eurocentric perspective and a perspective from the powerful, means it doesn't help to give us those powers to understand ourselves often. And that's a big criticism that's causing a lot of pain and distress in our community. And when you're looking at these young men that I was doing work with, oftentimes they aren't able to be recognized or taken seriously or being engaged with, even as people that have feelings. So I think that's a really important thing. And I think if we're looking for like constructive dialogue or conversation or change around that, I think we need to think more seriously about how we can engage in communities and how we can transform or adopt more of those kind of art-based and community-focused and interventions with that level of depth and engagement. And I think that that's a big problem from speaking from my perspective. And I think that's enough from me for now. And maybe we can kind of get into more of a conversation and see how it goes.
Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your research. I have a ton of questions. I have a lot of questions. But if anybody has any questions who's watching, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get through as many as we can. But I'll start with some of the ones that I have. Now, this is the questions that I have are based on what both of you have talked about in your research. So it will overlap mine. You can both come in on answers. Number one, Jason, you talked about Kimberly Crenshaw's research, which I did a little bit of as well, because I studied Black British history alongside working at De Montfort University, and this idea of intersectionality was really powerful when I looked at it. And I was saying, for both of you, how often is intersectionality considered in the fields that you're working in? Because it's not, I guess, how do you think of something as new? Kimberly Crenshaw said this, 40 years ago now, coming up to 40 years, when she started talking about intersectionality, but it seems now bringing in an idea that your race or that your religion or that your ableism might affect how your lived experience might affect your mental health is now just being considered. So what do we think about that?
It's an amazing question. And I think for me, the short answer is that I don't think we're quite ready for the conversation about intersectionality as a society from my experience. And it is limited, but I just know that there's been so many challenges to even the idea of whether or not racism is still a factor for so many of us who struggle to believe that a government could say something like that. then the idea of compounding that racism with other prejudices that people experience, it feels like a long way down the road. And that's not to dishearten anyone or myself, because we're still out here doing the work, even by being here today. But it's just to recognize that actually there's still a lot of denial of the existence of some of these very simple concepts around prejudice on one unitary axis, one single axis. And so if that is a struggle in that process, then how are we going to look at it in the context of multiple ways of thinking about people's individual experience? But that's not to say that we shouldn't keep trying. And your comment about, what did you say, Sophie, there? You said about Kimberly Crenshaw and the current focus. I think the COVID and its impact has had a massive reshaping of what it means to be self-caring and self-aware. And I would love for everyone to think about that on a personal level, because, you know, job satisfaction is no longer enough. You want job happiness now. We want people to feel well looked after, and to take that on board, like hold your employer accountable, or your school accountable, or your college. So with the new focus and reshaping of mental health and the crisis, I do feel like there's a new opportunities and a platform for us to think about what it means to be compassionate, self-compassionate. But and we should alongside that include the word intersectionality in there, so it does help us to diversify the experience that we're trying to capture. But I still have skepticism about how ready people are for that conversation. But I'd love to hear what you think, Yusuf.
Yeah, man. I think for me, the big thing is about intersectionality as the building of understanding and coalition, as opposed to there being a race to the bottom about who's suffering the most. Sometimes it turns into on Twitter and places like that, because that's not what it's about. Intersectionality, like in your work, when you're describing about ableism and race, where those two things meet, that should be a point where we try to build understanding and build recognition and look to make interventions that hopefully would benefit everybody. Because if you benefit often the worst off, or people that are suffering, oftentimes a lot of research shows that it benefits the whole of your society. So that's one thing. And I think that that's really crucial, because I think sometimes the language of intersectionality can be, misconstrued as being about, I'm from this community and you're not recognizing my community and no one else can understand my struggle. And it should really be about engagement, recognition, and understanding. And I think from a lot of disciplines that's missing, I wouldn't say just psychology, but it's particularly pertinent in relation to people's access to services. You see this across like healthcare as well, that people's ability to access services is often mediated by these intersectional factors. And having an understanding of these things is only going to help us to deliver better services and improve people's lives. So I think that from that perspective, it's much needed. And from the other side, where I talked earlier about the kind of blight of individualism, not that individualism always is bad, but that effect on our kind of construction of individuality, of intersectionality, can be problematic.
Okay, so we do have a question that's come forward, and it kind of links to what we were just talking about. And it says, what would it look like to be ready for the conversation around intersectionality? I mean, that was partly my question, because I know you're saying as well, we're not ready for that conversation. And I think, well, what does that readiness look like?
I think it would have to be a conversation that's based in love and care and compassion and empathy. And those are the qualities, or the kind of human qualities that we need to have that conversation. And I think, again, where we're talking about disciplines that are framed as sciences, oftentimes that goes missing.
Yeah.
When you frame something as a science, that has to be cold, it has to be neutral, it has to be like, to be able to engage and understand somebody else and somebody else's problems, you have to have those qualities. Those qualities are important to the way in which we care for each other and our well-being. And I think, again, if I return to my criticisms of psychology as a discipline, and that doesn't mean all psychologists and all psychologies, but when I'm thinking about a lot of the mainstream, like state-funded interventions, oftentimes that is missing. And I've read, I forgot the name of the author now, which is bad, but I read this idea of like a dam. So in some places, some ideas are dammed off from mainstream psychology, and they can't be fertilized or be developed in that way. But other ideas like the sciences are like flooding it. So you have this really uneven situation. And I think to be ready to have that conversation of how it would look is for those dams to be broken and to see more perspectives, particularly from emancipatory and critical psychology and these kind of spaces, decolonial movements, to be able to fertilize this. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I would really just support a lot of what you just said there, Yusuf, and thinking about this idea of who's asking those research questions in the academic sector, right? So I was blessed to be able to do my course, but some of the questions that were asked from colleagues of mine wouldn't have focused or centered race or the context of race and racism in an academic field. It's not something that's been, these things are under researched for a reason. And that damning, that idea of epistemological oppression, this idea of who creates the knowledge, is really important. I think that's so key to how we look at these questions and think about what it means to be ready. But I would also argue beyond the theoretical perspective that it's an individual pursuit. Like we talk about like our white friends, for instance, being ready to have conversations and doing the research before coming to ask us questions. I think that's also true of all prejudices. And I need to think about that in the context of lived experiences that I don't currently occupy. It's not my lived experience. So we all have work to do, and we all need to do it. And that includes thinking about those intersections and crossovers. But absolutely, it's not an oppression Olympics. It isn't about diluting your experience and making space for mine. Everyone's experience, there should be space for. And if there's not, then the system's broken.
Okay. I was going to ask, how much should lived experiences contribute to our research and the solutions that we find? Because talking about, the oppression Olympics, or it not being something where we're trying to say one group is suffering more than the other, but we're trying to bring awareness to the various experiences that people have. I now see myself being in a place where sometimes I'm in meetings and people are afraid to speak because they feel like I haven't got that lived experience. Therefore, what I'm saying can't be helpful, it can't contribute, and only people from a certain group can contribute if we're talking about ableism, if we're talking about disability, if we're talking about race. It can only be that group who has something to contribute. So do you think lived experience is central to both the research and the solutions? Or is there a line where we can draw from other experiences that might not be synonymous with that experience?
I think that speaks to this idea of what is an ally, right? And I think lived experience counts for a lot. And where there are platforms where people who have lived experience aren't heard, we should promote their voices, first of all. In addition to that, and not instead of that, we should also try and recognize what it means to be an ally. I attended a conference recently that my employer hosted around anti-racism, and one of the speakers spoke about this idea of you can't define yourself as an ally. You can't self-identify as an ally. The group in which you are trying to support should determine that. Yeah, so we all make these efforts and we can try our best to be aligned with the lived experiences of a group that we feel is victimized, oppressed, or marginalized. But we don't know what it means to be an ally until we're told that you're being helpful. And I think that's a really helpful place to hold on to how much you think, oh, I'm a feminist because I say so, but you're doing things that don't reinforce the values and beliefs of what feminism is, or an ideology around that where it improves the rights of women or other people who are from marginalized groups. So I think lived experience plays a massive role, but it's not the be all and end all for the problem. And like you said, Sophia, and I think Yusuf as well, we have to work with those who are most affected, because that will help everyone. Tolerance and inclusion and diversity, it will help everyone. It's not just for that group.
Okay. Do you have something to say there, Yusuf, or should we move on to the next question?
No, move on, because we want to get some more questions.
Okay. All right, and so we've got another question that's come up from the audience, and is, what do you think universities and student unions should do to tackle the mental health stigma of men?
Yusuf, you want to take this one?
I don't mind. I think it's a complicated issue because I think a lot's made of the mental health stigma. that is connected to men. But I think at the same time, that stigma is reinforced, and also the help isn't available. That's what I think. I think that we talk a lot on Twitter about men should take mental health seriously, but men will make the call to the mental health services and there won't be support, particularly if they're black men. Do you know how hard it is to get a black counsellor through the NHS? Unless you've got the money to pay for it, it's very difficult. So I think when we're talking about stigma, we should also be talking about what actually is available, what services are available. So we can say, all right, there's no stigma to come forward. And you saw in my article, my man, he's a road man. He's been doing stuff, like he's got a certain kind of masculinity. But even him, in certain situations, he'll explain that he's feeling things and he has this depth of feeling. Or, do you know what I mean? People do bear all, and people are open to exploring that. This idea that they're not, I think, is a bit of a cop-out, actually, from policymakers who aren't really willing to put the money up and the resources up to provide services really to support men. And I think men at the moment, one of the situations is there's been a lot of changes in, the organization of our society, who earns money, what the status of men is in the family. And these are progressive changes often, but they leave men in a bit of an in-between space. They're not really sure what kind of masculinity they should be performing. And I think these are issues that we could be talking about how to do progressive masculinity. If you want to talk about outside of actually direct mental health support, there are a lot of sort of related issues that we could be exploring, because there's a lot of stuff about how men shouldn't behave, which is valid. Of course it's valid. But there's not a lot of space, I think, for men to co-make progressive and be supported in developing progressive masculinities. And Bell Hooks, actually, she died recently, a very well-known feminist cultural critic. She talked about that. She talked about the young men who were, in today's language, probably described as woke, but were trying to do what Jason said, the work to kind of develop these better masculinities, actually then being sidelined by their peer groups, being sidelined by women or romantic interests, because they weren't performing masculinity as our society kind of prescribes it. And I think those are the conversations we have to have, particularly around masculinity, about what is a desirable masculinity and how can masculinity look and how can it be performed. But also, like, our friends from the LGBTQ plus community who are actively pushing those boundaries and doing things that are new, we should also be working to support and celebrate them as well. Because I think that that's important, because ultimately, I think a lot of our problems come from our understanding of masculinity and it being a bit at sea at the moment. That when society it's still a patriarchal society, but when it was organized in more explicit patriarchal terms, the violence was done in a different way. But now that's been unseated, there's a kind of violence in uncertainty that's happening with young men. But anyway, that was a bit of a rant, so I'll stop now.
Okay, do you want to come in that, Jason, or should I move on to the next question?
Just very quickly, I wanted to, and I don't think that was a rant at all, Yusef, but I think I was just going to speak to, I really appreciate the question, Aaliyah, and I think it's a helpful one. But it's also a good example of how we can try and apply the intersectional lens to this question right here, in that if you ask a man who is in need of mental health support, what he thinks that would look like, you will get a different answer from each man you ask, based on, one, their protected characteristics, two, how they choose to identify, and three, a diverse range of reasons what make them individual and who they are. So I guess maybe the question could be dissected further, and maybe this idea of men, it's not a helpful category anymore, because there's so much diversity within that community of men, just men, that we need to ask a question to individuals about how it may look and how it may feel to be better supported by institutions and unions that support these populations. And yeah, I think that's the start of an important question. It speaks to my title of my research. Like, I wanted to speak to the participants' backgrounds individually, rather than say BAME or minoritized groups. There's something about that focus on the individual person's experience that I think is really quite powerful, and we can, with a bit more time and effort, capture. That's what I was going to add very quickly. Sorry.
And I'll just add to
Okay.
Sorry, that's what I'm thinking here, is that historically, disproportionately as well, the state does violence to certain kinds of people. And when you talk about men, particularly Black American ethnic men, there's forms of violence that can be done to these people also through intervention. So when we're talking about how can we get these people to accept interventions, we also have to ask, are interventions any good? And what are interventions, and how are we designing these interventions, and why are we designing them? And I think going back to, it's like what Jason said, how can these people conceive of help? How do people conceive of help? And what would be helpful for people? I don't think that's coming into the discussion enough, if I'm being honest. Anyway, sorry, carry on, Sophie.
Well, something that you were both saying, I believe, is that we need to consider the individual experiences, because what one man says might be helpful for them might not be helpful for somebody else. How then do we have impact on a community or a collective level then, if we're considering all these individual experiences? Like, how is that possible? How do we then come together to kind of, I don't want to say find a solution, because I don't think a solution, but to kind of offer treatment if we're considering all the individual experiences, whereas
what Jason said at the beginning of his talk is exactly the starting point. Is that Jason obviously is self-defining himself as a practitioner, as somebody that is a facilitator who is engaging in communities, in problems, in issues, and trying to understand them at that level, and trying to organize people around what is important to them, how they feel, how they identify. And I think a more grounded approach to psychology in that way, it's expensive. The problem is it's expensive, and it's hard to unify it and measure it in the way we measure things. So nowadays, when you do a project, they want to have a kind of evaluation that's done over key criteria, which is decided at a kind of higher level as this money is being administered downwards. But I think actually psychologists are practitioners in community. And it's about helping people to understand at a community level, helping people to think about different ways they can be supported and empowered at a community level to find better understandings and ways of living which help them, that support them. Anyway, that's my contribution. I don't know if you want to pick up on
that. Yeah, I agree. I agree.
No,
I think it's an important question. I think this idea of how money is spent on services is always going to be an attempt to categorize and group. And I recognize the need for that on a level, but how those services are defined, I think, is what Yusuf speaking to. How the approaches that are taken, the acknowledgement of the social context of the individuals that come to you, the recognition of their intersectional experience, and then the application of support that recognizes that and reinforces that you are individual and not just one unitary defining characteristic, is going to make people feel so much better about themselves. We talk about sense of belonging, and we talk about a sense of inclusion, but we really categorize people really on very broad, singular terms, and I think that doesn't help anyone at any point. Policymakers need to spend more time thinking about it and maybe speak to the service user involvement, what do they call it, pupil voice. With all these words for ways to include the groups that we want to at every level, and there's policies around it, but yet still it's not manifesting in the ways that we want it to. So I don't know, like, let's keep trying.
I guess the question that I have then, because we're wrapping up, so we only have time for a few more questions, is it's something that you talked about, Jason, but how do people self-advocate for themselves?
Just to add something.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah.
What was that? Sorry, you gonna add something?
We have a bit of a delay with Yusuf, so I wasn't sure if you were saying there was something that you wanted to add.
I just wanted to add that, just for context, out of, I don't know, 50 local wards, is it in London? There's about 50 wards of different wards where they provide mental health support via the NHS. Only 2 or 3 of them offered bespoke support to the Black community. And that's an example of how far away we are from what I'm saying. What I'm saying probably is the radical end of that thinking, but we are a long way away from having a health service or mental health services that recognize difference and recognize the absence of alternatives for people. And I think that is a big problem, and it's something that needs to change, basically. Sorry, carry on.
I was going to say that in that current climate where we're lacking the research and the resources to understand people's intersectionality and their lived experience and how that is impacting their mental health, how then do we encourage people to self-advocate for themselves if they find themselves in a situation where they know something isn't right, they know that maybe their thinking is different, they just know that, yeah, they know within themselves that I need to get help. How do people then self-advocate for themselves within this system that at the moment isn't really as supportive as it needs to be?
I mean, my thoughts on that are around education, both formal and informal. And I guess the want for me is that as a psychologist and a practitioner, I'm hoping that I can offer spaces or insight or help, however you want to frame it, which reaches multiple levels. So Yusuf speaks about policy and practice quite a lot, and I think that's such an important approach. But Yusuf also speaks about the community approach and being there on the ground. So if it's top down and bottom up, hopefully we're going to meet somewhere in the middle is the intention. So why I say that is because the idea of giving away psychology is an important aspect of what I think community psychology is and how I choose to practice. And that speaks to how Yusuf and I have spoken about positionality in the context of our research, because we recognize that we are who we are. We chose our research ideas and we followed it through with a participant group that we hoped would be helped by engagement in that process. But we too have come from a place, personally, I'm happy to say, of learning and hard work and resilience through the academic career that has led us to a point where we now have a platform. So what we're trying to do here is use that to support the idea that insight will help everyone, and that education comes from multiple places. So it could be in classrooms, it could be that you click onto a YouTube link, or it could be that your university's curriculum includes ideas around what it means to support yourself, to self-advocate for your mental health. And I think at the multiple levels, if we're helping friends to help friends, if we're helping teachers to help students, if we're helping policymakers to help larger portions of the community, we're doing a good job. But it has to be multi-pronged.
Okay. So we've got you. We can have you give one quick comment on that as well, Yusuf, before we wrap up.
I'm not good at quick comments, you know that now. I think, for example, I saw there was a question about students' unions. I think communicating to organizations like universities and schools how important it is to change or transform or open their approach. Because, for example, universities have actually one of the consequences of tuition fees.
Sorry, I think you're just cutting up there, Yusuf. I'm not sure if that's
that they have a stronger sense of responsibility about student welfare now than they did in the past. And I think they can be organizations where, sorry, this is an example, can pressure universities or try to pressure universities into changing the kinds of support they offer or offering a more diverse form of support. There was COVID where people were doing people's shoppings for them and things like that. But one thing about sort of critical psychology and other kind of related subsections is that actually as I go and start practicing psychology, because that's a specific thing, but there are a lot of people that aren't psychologists, like youth workers, community workers, that are actually doing work that benefits people's mental health. So there's a ways in which that we can treat each other, that we can approach.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Sorry, Yusuf. I think we missed you at the end. Some of the things that you were saying there. So I'm sorry for anybody who might not have got what he was saying. But I just want to thank both of you so much for just being willing to have this talk today about mental health, the Black community, some of the solutions that are happening within the field. And I think one thing that really resonated with me is that there are no easy answers. It's going to take a lot of work in order to give the support and the support that we need to diverse communities. But there are people working in the field, and that's what we have to continue doing. So I want to thank Jason. I want to thank you, Yusuf, so much for this talk, and thank you for joining us on another episode of the Anti-Racism series. And be sure to check out De Montfort University's Black History Month link to see what other events and talks will be happening for the entire month of October. Thank you.